Is mayonnaise an instrument? That is Patrick Starr, dead serious, holding a jar of mayonnaise like it is a woodwind, in the band tryout scene from the episode called Band Geeks. I bring it up first because of how much weight that one small line has ended up carrying over the years. It shows up in interview headlines, shows up in fan compilations and quiz nights, and apparently, in the questions journalists still ask Bill Fagerbakke, the man who has voiced Patrick since the very beginning, when they want him reminiscing about nearly 3 decades of work, as though the whole career could be folded into one starfish holding a condiment jar up to his mouth. And in a strange way it can be. That is rather the thing about this show. Smallest, silliest fragments turn out to be load-bearing. You tug on one, and something else, something you did not expect, comes up with it. So that is what we are doing tonight. We are doing the iceberg. If you have spent any time in the corners of the internet where people organize a show's trivia into a picture of an iceberg, you already know the shape of what is coming. If you have not, here's the idea in brief, and then I will leave the metaphor alone and just use it as a map. Fans draw a big chunk of ice, mostly submerged, and they divide it into bands. Up at the surface, above the waterline, sits the stuff everybody already knows, the kind of thing you could get right on a trivia night without trying. A little further down, still fairly shallow, sits the stuff real fans know, the trivia that takes an actual habit of watching interviews and reading wiki pages to pick up. Deeper than that, you get into the material that takes real digging, the cutscenes, the international censorship, the contradictions the show itself never bothered to resolve, and at the very bottom, in the parts of the chart people half joke about needing a diving bell for, you get the stuff that is disputed, unconfirmed, sometimes genuinely upsetting, and always worth being honest about which category it belongs to. There are real charts like this, built specifically for this show, by fans with a frankly heroic amount of patience, cataloging well over 100 entries in some versions and more than 200 in others. I am not going to walk you through any one specific chart line by line tonight, as that would mean pausing constantly to argue about placement, and that is not really an evening's entertainment. It is homework. Instead, I am going to take the shape of the thing, surface down to the deep trench, and fill each layer with material I have actually gone and checked. Some of it you will already know. Some of it, I suspect, you will not. And a good portion of what lives down in the lower layers of any iceberg like this is speculation dressed up as fact, so I want to be careful about labeling which is which as we go. When something is confirmed, documented, on the record, I will tell you plainly. When something is a theory fans have floated, however popular, I will say so just as plainly, because the whole point of an honest dissent is that you can trust the depth markers. There is no ranking here, no countdown, no twist waiting at the bottom. Nothing in this script builds toward anything else. Each layer, each little block of material, stands on its own, so if you drift off somewhere in the middle you have not missed a payoff, because there is not one to miss. That is rather the design. Tonight is for going under, not for staying sharp. If you like this sort of thing, there is a subscribe button somewhere. No pressure either way. That is the only time I will mention it. Right. Let us start with the part sitting right at the top, above the waterline. Stuff that is less a secret and more just common knowledge. The sort of facts that would barely count as trivia at all, except that it is worth having them laid out plainly before we go anywhere deeper, as everything below rests on this foundation. The show was created by a man named Stephen Hillenburg, and if you only remember one biographical fact about him, let it be that he did not start out as an animator. He started out as a marine biologist. He studied natural resource planning with an interest in marine science at Humboldt State University, then went on to teach marine biology at the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, California, a hands-on marine education center where he spent his days introducing children to tide pools, to the actual creatures that live in the wet sand and under the rocks at low tide. While he was there, he produced an unpublished educational comic called The Intertidal Zone, meant to illustrate exactly those tide pool creatures for students. Buried inside that comic was an early sponge character he called Bob the Sponge. That character is, quite directly, the ancestor of the sponge, sitting in the title of the series you already know. I will come back to that comic later, because it explains more about the cartoon's visual design than people tend to give it credit for. For now, hold on to the basic shape of it. This entire franchise begins life as a teaching aid for children learning about tide pools, made by a man who loved the ocean floor enough to spend a decade studying it before he ever pitched a cartoon. He later trained in experimental animation at CalArts, worked in television animation, notably as a director on Rocko's Modern Life, and only after that show ended did he begin developing his own series, first under the working title SpongeBob Ahoy. The premiere itself has a specific, almost ceremonial date attached to it. The cartoon first aired on Nickelodeon on the 1st of May, 1999, timed to air right after that year's Kids' Choice Awards, which was a deliberate scheduling choice to hand the new show the biggest possible audience on its very first night. As of tonight, that puts the show at roughly 27 years old. I want to be precise about that number, as it drifts depending on when a given video gets made, and it is easy to grab an old figure and repeat it without checking. 27 years, not 25. The show is old enough now that a person could have grown up with it, had their own children, and shown it to them, and the franchise would still be airing new episodes the whole time. Longer than most marriages, longer than most careers, longer, frankly, than most countries manage to keep the same currency in circulation without some kind of reform, and longer, quite honestly, than most of the actors playing SpongeBob's own closest friends have managed to keep any other single job across their entire working lives. The main cast, at the surface level, is short enough to name properly. SpongeBob himself is voiced by Tom Kenny, who has been in the role since the beginning, and who, as we will get into later, does considerably more voice work on this show than most casual viewers realize. Squidward Tentacles is voiced by Roger Bumpass. Mr. Krabs is voiced by Clancy Brown. Patrick Star is voiced by Bill Fagerbakke. Sandy Cheeks is voiced by Carolyn Lawrence. Plankton, the franchise's recurring antagonist, is voiced by a man who goes by the stage name Mr. Lawrence, born Doug Lawrence, who has also worked behind the scenes for decades as a writer and, by most accounts, the show's longtime story editor. That is the core group, and every one of them has been doing this job, more or less without interruption, for the better part of 3 decades. It is itself a fairly unusual thing in television. Voice casts change. Actors age out of roles, move on, get replaced. This cast largely has not. The show has also, by now, produced a large body of feature films built around the same characters. First, released in 2004, is generally just called the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, and I will have quite a lot to say about the circumstances of its production a little further down in this descent, because those circumstances turn out to be more interesting than the plot of the movie itself. There have been sequels and spin-off films since, stretching all the way up to a theatrical release in December of last year, which I will also come back to later, because its box office numbers tell a specific and slightly melancholy story about where this franchise sits today, compared to a decade ago. And then there are the records, is where the surface layer earns its keep as impressive, rather than merely familiar. As of February of last year, SpongeBob SquarePants officially became the longest-running animated children's television show in American history, passing Arthur, which ran for 25 seasons and 253 episodes between 1996 and 2022. SpongeBob had already been the first Nickelodeon cartoon ever to cross the 200-episode mark, and by the middle of this year the show sits somewhere past 330 aired half-hour episodes across 17 seasons, with 2 more full seasons, 13 episodes apiece, already announced. Do the arithmetic on that, and you get a franchise closing in on 370 episodes once those air. It also holds the record for the most Kids' Choice Awards wins for Favorite Cartoon, 22 in total and still climbing, taking the prize nearly every single year since 2003, with just one loss along the way, back in 2008, when it lost to Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is at least a respectable show to lose to. Guinness World Records has separately named it the most popular children's television show on the planet, and by some industry estimates it draws demand many times beyond that of an average television show. A strange statistic to absorb, as it means a cartoon about a sponge who works at a fast food restaurant under the sea is, by some measurable standard, one of the most consumed pieces of media on Earth. That is the surface. Familiar, sturdy, the kind of thing you already half knew walking in. None of it should surprise you. What I want you to notice, though, heading into the next layer down, is how much of that surface material already has a shadow attached to it, a piece of context that only shows up once you go looking. The creator was a marine biologist first. The cast has barely changed in a quarter century. The records keep accumulating. Every one of those surface facts has a stranger footnote sitting just beneath it, and that is where we are headed next. Now we go a little further down, into the band of the iceberg that fans usually mean when they say deep cut. Kind of trivia you would only know if you had spent time with the interviews rather than just the episodes. And a good place to start is with the name of the series itself, as for a long stretch of its development, this was not going to be called SpongeBob SquarePants at all. Hillenburg's original working title was SpongeBoy Ahoy, and the character himself was simply called SpongeBoy. There is a persistent piece of internet folklore claiming the name had to be changed, because SpongeBoy was already trademarked by a mop product, which is a tidy little story, the kind that gets repeated because it sounds plausible and vaguely funny. Sponge losing his own name to a literal sponge on a stick. It is not true, or at least, it is not the real reason. The actual prior claim on the name traces back to a 1990s line of pencils made by a company called Pentec, marketed under the name Cool Art, featuring a character called SpongeBoy, designed by an artist named Kevin Pope. There is also a separate character with a similar name in Bob Burden's comic book series, Flaming Carrot Comics, though how directly that connects to the actual naming dispute is still debated by people who track this sort of thing closely. Either way, the mop story is a myth, a comfortable urban legend standing in for a duller, more paperwork-shaped truth about pencil branding. Once the SpongeBoy name was off the table, Hillenburg added SquarePants as a surname, partly to keep that distinctive silhouette right there in the title, so that even before you saw the character, the shape of him was already promised to you by the name alone. There is a detail that tends to surprise people about how the cartoon actually got greenlit in the first place. Hillenburg's pitch meeting at Nickelodeon was not a stack of slides and a nervous walkthrough. He and his creative director on the project, Derek Dryman, built a miniature version of Bikini Bottom, populated with little squeezy toy versions of the characters, and set the whole thing up inside an actual aquarium. They wheeled it into the pitch room under a sheet, like a magician's prop, then walked in themselves wearing loud Hawaiian shirts, playing Hawaiian music off a boombox, and pitched the pilot episode, Help Wanted, as pure performance before anybody in the room had seen a single frame of finished animation. Eric Coleman, who was Nickelodeon's vice president of animation development at the time, later said Hillenburg had really gone above and beyond, and by most accounts the executives stepped out of the room, conferred for a short while, and came back and said yes almost immediately. It is a nice thing to picture. A marine biologist in a costume shirt, unveiling a diorama under a sheet like a magic trick, and having it work on the very first try. What I find myself circling back to with that particular story, how much confidence it must have taken to bet an entire pitch meeting on spectacle rather than substance. Most pitches that fail quietly, in a room where nobody remembers exactly what went wrong. A pitch built around Hawaiian shirts and a hidden aquarium either becomes a legendary origin story or a slightly embarrassing anecdote nobody brings up again, and there is not much room in between those two outcomes. Hillenburg had spent years by that point building tide pool dioramas for actual school children, though in a strange way the pitch was not really a departure from his working life at all. It was the exact same skill, presenting a small constructed world to an audience and asking them to care about what lives inside it, just aimed at executives instead of 8-year-olds on a field trip. Take Vincent Waller, who is one of the franchise's 2 current showrunners, alongside Mark Ceccarelli. Waller's relationship with this franchise starts almost as an accident of bad timing rather than good planning. Back in 1999, he had his own pitch in front of Nickelodeon for a short intended for their Oh Yeah Cartoons anthology block, and it got passed over in favor of what eventually became SpongeBob. Though before Waller was ever part of the show was, in a sense, the reason his own project did not happen. He joined the SpongeBob crew properly later, worked the first 2 seasons, left, came back starting with season 4, and has been there ever since, eventually rising to co-showrunner. Ceccarelli, for his part, has been aboard since season 8. Between the two of them, they have now steered this franchise for longer than most shows even manage to exist. Now, the theme song. Everyone can hum it, and I would guess a fair number of people watching this could recite the spoken introduction word for word without trying. What is less commonly known is who actually wrote it, and who performs it. The music was composed by Blaze Smith and Mark Harrison, with lyrics credited to Hillenburg himself along with Derek Dryman, the same collaborator from the aquarium pitch. It was deliberately modeled on a real sea shanty called Blow the Man Down, right down to the call and response structure. One voice asking a question, a chorus answering it, and the voice singing it is not any member of the main cast. It is a veteran voice actor named Patrick Pinney, performing as a character called Painty the Pirate, who is, on screen, quite literally a painting that sings, accompanied by a children's chorus. So the best-known piece of music in the entire franchise is sung by a character who is not a person, an animal, or a sea creature of any kind. Just an old painting on a wall, brought briefly to life for about 20 seconds at the top of every episode. Here is where the casting stories start, and I think they are worth lingering on, because the finished voices feel so inevitable once you have heard them for 27 years, that it is easy to forget how much of this was improvised, redirected, or arrived at sideways rather than planned from the start. Tom Kenny's Red for SpongeBob has been described, by both Kenny himself and by Hillenburg, as a blend of Stan Laurel and Jerry Lewis, what they have both called a child-man quality, an ostensibly grown character who nonetheless behaves like an overexcited kid. Hillenburg separately compared the type to Pee Wee Herman, another performer built around the same joke, an adult body running on childlike logic. That description alone tells you something about why the character has aged so well. He was never designed as a kid's character pretending to be simple. He was designed as a very old kind of comic archetype, transplanted onto a sea sponge. Clancy Brown's Mr. Krabs voice, that thick, piratey, Scottish-tinged brogue, was not a note Hillenburg gave him. Brown improvised it live, right there in the audition room. Culturally, that particular sound, stereotypical pirate voice most English-language media, reaches for whenever a character needs to sound seafaring and gruff, traces back to Robert Newton's performance as Long John Silver in Disney's 1950 adaptation of Treasure Island. A performance so influential it more or less invented the pirate voice as a genre convention. Brown has described his own read as landing in that Treasure Island pirate territory, rather than being a direct impression of Newton, which feels right. It is less a copy than a shared inheritance, same well that half of English-language pirate fiction has been drawing from for 75 years. And now for my favorite of these, the one I think about more than the others, which is Mr. Lawrence and Plankton. Mr. Lawrence, born Douglas Lawrence Osowski, the cartoon's longtime writer and producer, who also happens to voice its primary antagonist. What is not as widely known, that his audition was not for Plankton at all. He originally tried out for the role of SpongeBob himself, using the same raspy, wound-up voice that would eventually become Plankton's signature sound. Hillenburg did not hand him the villain role on the spot, either, which is how the story sometimes gets simplified in retelling. What actually happened, according to Lawrence's own account as he has told it in interviews since, that Hillenburg joked he would cast Lawrence as SpongeBob if he had the nerve, then gave the title role to Tom Kenny instead, and only afterward circled back and told Lawrence that the voice he had brought to the audition suited the villain better. So the actor who plays the Sponge's most persistent enemy, the man plotting endlessly to steal the restaurant's secret formula, is, quite literally, a voice that almost was SpongeBob. I find that an odd thing to hold on to. Every scene of Plankton scheming against SpongeBob carries this faint, invisible echo of the fact that in some earlier version of the casting room, before anyone had committed to anything, those two characters could have been voiced by the same person, switched into different roles, or, further back still, could have been the same character altogether. Roger Bumpass, who plays Squidward, has a casting footnote of his own, though this one is less about how he got the role and more about correcting a myth that has calcified into accepted fact online. The internet's favorite explanation for Squidward's voice is that Bumpass modeled it on the comedian Jack Benny, and it gets repeated constantly. Trivia videos, comment sections, as though it were settled. Bumpass himself has rejected it outright, on record, with about as flat a denial as an actor gives, dismissing the Jack Benny comparison entirely. What he actually credits is Tim Conway, specifically Conway's sad sack physical comedy style from his stage work, The Put Upon, defeated body language rather than any particular vocal cadence. It is a small correction, but I think it matters, because it is a case where the fandom's confident answer and the actual performer's stated answer simply do not match, and the fandom's version is the one that keeps circulating. Carolyn Lawrence, who voices Sandy Cheeks, got her shot at the role through something closer to chance than campaign. She met a casting director named Donna Grillo on a sidewalk in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, introduced by a mutual friend who happened to mention, almost as an aside, that Lawrence had an interesting voice. Grillo brought her in off the back of that one comment, not off a submitted resume or a formal casting call. It is a reminder of how much of this industry, even for a role that would go on to last decades, can hinge on a passing remark between strangers on a street. Bill Fagerbakke's path to Patrick has its own small, oddly touching detail. He auditioned after Tom Kenny had already been locked in as SpongeBob, and Hillenburg played him Kenny's recorded SpongeBob voice on a cassette player right there in the room, specifically so Fagerbakke could build Patrick as a kind of counterpart, a voice reacting to the one that already existed, rather than existing in isolation. In those early years, Fagerbakke has said that he privately called Patrick Aquadauber, a nod to his other well-known role at the time, assistant Coach Dauber, on the sitcom Coach. So Patrick's dim, warm, endlessly loyal voice was built, quite deliberately, as a response to SpongeBob's, the two characters designed almost like a duet from the very first day of recording. And here is a piece of trivia I like precisely because it scrambles the on-screen relationships. Bill Talley, who voices Karen, the sarcastic computer wife of Plankton, is married in real life not to Mr. Lawrence, her character's on-screen husband, but to Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob. They married years before the franchise even existed, by most accounts in the mid-1990s, and have 2 children together. So the Sponge and the villain's computer wife are the real married couple. The on-screen villain couple, Plankton and Karen, share no such relationship off-camera at all. It is the kind of coincidence that would feel too neat if you put it in a script on purpose. I want to close this layer of the descent with one more casting story. Though this one is not about how a voice began, it is about how two of them ended, and it is worth telling carefully, as it is a rather lovely piece of behind-the-scenes history. Not a sad one, even though it involves two deaths. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, the aging, semi-retired superheroes who show up periodically to bicker and reminisce, were voiced for years by Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway, the same Tim Conway whose stage comedy shaped Squidward's voice, incidentally, though that is a separate thread. Borgnine and Conway had a real friendship going back decades before SpongeBob, having co-starred together on the 1960s sitcom McHale's Navy. Borgnine died in 2012. Conway died on the 14th of May, 2019, at 85 years old, from complications described at the time as water on the brain. For Hillenburg's own wishes, neither role was ever recast with a sound-alike replacement. Rather than hire someone new to imitate two performances that could not be replaced, the series simply let the characters go quiet, reducing them to non-speaking. Background appearances from that point on. It was a deliberate choice, not an oversight, and I think it says something decent about how this particular production has generally chosen to handle its own losses, not by pretending nothing happened, and not by pretending the voice could just be swapped out like a spare part. Just a quiet retirement, built into the background of episodes, for two old friends who are not there to perform it anymore. There is a particular kind of restraint in that choice that I think is worth pausing on for a second, even in a script that promised earlier not to lean on that exact phrase too often. Recasting would have been the easier option, commercially speaking. Nobody outside the truly dedicated corners of the fandom would necessarily have complained loudly about a sound-alike stepping into either role, and the characters could have kept appearing in new material indefinitely, business as usual. Choosing the quieter option instead, letting two supporting characters simply fade toward the edges of the frame rather than replacing the men who originated them, is the kind of decision that costs a production something, in flexibility if nothing else, purely so that two performances built by two specific people, decades ago, do not get diluted by an impersonation of either of them. So that is the upper layer, the part of the iceberg that rewards actually reading the interviews rather than just watching the show. What strikes me, pulling all of that together, how little of it was planned in advance. The pitch was theater. The crab's voice was improvised on the spot. The villain's voice used to be the hero's voice. The casting director met her sandy cheeks on a sidewalk. None of that reads like a tightly managed franchise machine. It reads like a small group of people making quick, instinctive decisions in a room, decisions that then had to hold up for 27 years, which, against the odds, they mostly have. Which brings us to a different kind of upper layer material. The well-documented controversies, the episodes and moments that got the show actual real-world attention it did not necessarily want. Still fairly shallow water as far as the iceberg goes, in the sense that most of what follows has been covered in mainstream outlets at some point, but it is worth laying out properly. Because a lot of it gets flattened into rumor when it gets passed around secondhand, and the actual documented version is usually stranger and more specific than the flattened version. Start with the January 2005 controversy involving the Christian broadcaster James Dobson, a focus on the family, as this one gets misremembered constantly, in a way that is worth correcting carefully. The popular shorthand version of the story is that Dobson called SpongeBob gay. That is not strictly what happened. What actually drew his criticism was a children's tolerance and diversity video, produced by Nile Rodgers' We Are Family Foundation, built around the song We Are Family, which featured a huge roster of licensed characters, SpongeBob among many, many others, all lending their faces to a message about tolerance and inclusion. Dobson criticized that video specifically, framing its language around tolerance and diversity as coded advocacy, and media coverage at the time widely, rather lazily, compressed his actual remarks into the much punchier claim that he had called a cartoon sponge gay. Dobson himself later pushed back on that characterization, saying it misrepresented what he had actually argued. I do not think this changes much about how strange the whole episode looks in hindsight. A serious broadcaster weighing in on a children's tolerance video featuring dozens of cartoon mascots. But it is worth getting the actual shape of the claim right, rather than repeating the tidier, angrier version that has calcified into common knowledge. I bring this one up first, ahead of the louder, more dramatic controversies further down this layer, because it is a fairly clean example of a pattern that repeats constantly whenever a piece of children's media brushes up against a wider cultural argument. The original claim is usually narrower, more hedged, more specific than whatever version eventually spreads. The compressed version travels faster precisely because it is compressed. A single punchy sentence beats a paragraph of careful framing every time it gets shared. By the time a claim like that reaches a comment section or a clip show years later, the original argument has often been sanded down into something its own author would not recognize, and Dobson's actual remarks about a tolerance video get flattened into 4 words about a sponge that never actually got said. Now for a properly upsetting piece of the franchise's own broadcast history, though I need to tread lightly with the framing here, because this is a case where the popular version overstates what has actually been confirmed. The episode One Course Meal from Season 7 is routinely cited, including by outlets like WatchMojo, as the single worst-regarded episode the cartoon has ever produced, and the plot explains why fairly quickly. Mr. Krabs discovers that Plankton has a genuine phobia of whales, and rather than let the information sit, he weaponizes it, disguising Pearl, his own whale daughter, to terrorize Plankton into what plays on screen as an apparent suicide attempt, all handled as comedy, with Krabs facing no consequences whatsoever for engineering it. It generated real backlash, including Change.org petitions specifically asking Nickelodeon to pull the episode, and it is now rarely rerun. What I want to flag is the claim, which circulates constantly, that the episode was formally banned by a regulator, sometimes specifically Ofcom in the UK. I have not been able to confirm any such formal ban in the sourcing available to me, so I am going to describe it the way the evidence actually supports, as an episode that was widely criticized, generated genuine organized petitions, and has been rarely rerun since, rather than stating outright that some regulatory body issued an official ban. The distinction matters. Quiet, informal avoidance by a network and a formal government ban are 2 very different things. Only the first one is actually documented here. Take Midlife Crustacean from Season 5, which sits on much firmer factual ground, because this one really was formally pulled. In 2018, Nickelodeon conducted an internal standards and practices review of its own back catalog, and specifically pulled this episode from rotation over a scene where Mr. Krabs, SpongeBob, and Patrick steal women's underwear off a clothesline as part of a prank plot, material that a reassessment years after the original airing judged inappropriate for the cartoon's audience. It briefly resurfaced on Paramount Plus in 2023, apparently due to a technical error in the back catalog, or being pulled again almost immediately. So this is a case of a network actually revisiting its own decades-old content and deciding, on reflection, that a joke which made it to air the first time around should not have. Here is one I find more interesting than upsetting, because it is really a story about timing rather than content. Quarantine Crab was a fully finished, ready-to-air episode, built around a plot where the Krusty Krab gets placed under quarantine. Nickelodeon had it in the can and scheduled, and then held it back from its planned 2020 broadcast slot in the United States for one very specific reason. Its plot happened to line up, almost eerily, with the actual COVID-19 pandemic that was unfolding in the real world exactly that moment. Rather than air a comedy about quarantine while the entire country was living through one, they simply shelved it in America. It did not vanish everywhere, though. France aired it that same year, in May of 2020, apparently without the same hesitation. The episode did not finally reach American broadcast until April of 2022. By the time it aired, it had been reframed, positioned around Earth Day and an environmental message rather than its original quarantine premise, timed for the 22nd of April rather than whatever its original release window would have been. So you have a single piece of finished television shelved for 2 full years, purely because the real world briefly, uncomfortably matched the fiction, then quietly repositioned and released once the discomfort had faded. That is an unusual case in television generally, not just for this show. Most delayed episodes get delayed for production reasons, budget, scheduling, technical problems. This one got delayed because reality was, for a while, simply too on the nose. There is something almost funny about that kind of bad luck, in hindsight, though I doubt it felt funny to whoever had to make the call to pull it. A finished episode is a strange object to be stuck holding. The jokes do not age the way news does, but the context around them absolutely can, and for a couple of years this particular episode sat in a kind of limbo. Too finished to rework from scratch, too close to real events to simply air as originally intended. Reframing it around Earth Day rather than quarantine was a fairly elegant way out of that bind. A small act of editorial patience that most viewers watching the eventual broadcast would never have any reason to suspect had happened at all. Nasty Patty deserves its own moment here too, because the popular assumption about this episode is usually wrong in a specific, checkable way. People tend to say it was never officially banned anywhere, treating its reputation as scary purely as an internet exaggeration. That is not accurate. It really was pulled from broadcast in at least 2 specific international markets. The Hebrew language dub was pulled in Israel, and the episode was pulled from broadcast entirely on the EBS network in South Korea, in both cases specifically because it was judged too frightening for its target audience. The premise involves what looks, the SpongeBob, like a health inspector's death, staged as a prank by Mr. Krabs and Plankton working together for once, and the tone of the episode does tip into something closer to a thriller than a comedy for long stretches. So the episode was not banned in the United States, where it aired without incident, but it absolutely was banned, formally, in specific other countries, which makes its actual censorship history a patchwork, rather than a single clean yes or no answer. That patchwork quality, I think, is the more interesting fact than either the flat never banned claim or the flat banned claim on their own. Different countries, watching the exact same episode, reached noticeably different conclusions about whether it was fit to broadcast to children. And one more from this layer, as it shows the show reaching into real-world politics in a way that has nothing to do with fright or nudity or dark comedy, everything to do with a single line of dialogue landing at the wrong cultural moment. The episode SpongeBob, You're Fired, from 2013, has a fairly simple premise. Mr. Krabs fires SpongeBob purely to save money, nothing more dramatic than a workplace cost-cutting decision. But one line from that episode, spoken as SpongeBob searches for new work, "Unemployment may be fun to you, but I need to get a job," got pulled out of context and used as rhetorical ammunition in an actual cable news and newspaper argument about food stamp and social safety net policy. Media Matters for America and the commentator Al Sharpton both accused certain outlets, including the New York Post and Fox News, of using that single line from a children's cartoon as a talking point against welfare policy, essentially treating SpongeBob's fictional job search as evidence about how real unemployed people should feel about needing government assistance. It is a strange thing to picture. A cartoon written for children becoming, briefly, a genuine culture war flashpoint on cable news, all traceable back to one sentence spoken by an animated sponge about needing to find work. So that is the controversy layer, still fairly close to the surface as these charts go, in the sense that most of it made real news at the time. What I keep noticing across all of these is how differently each institution involved responded to roughly the same category of problem, a joke, or a plot point that aged badly, or landed badly, or simply arrived at the wrong moment. Nickelodeon pulled one episode permanently and rebroadcast another 2 years late with a new coat of paint. Other countries banned an episode America let air freely. Cable news argument grabbed one sentence and ran with it for a news cycle before moving on. None of these are the same kind of controversy. I think it is worth resisting the urge to flatten them into one single story about the show getting in trouble. They are really several small, distinct stories about how differently the world reacts to the same piece of children's entertainment depending on where you are standing when you watch it. Right, we are properly into the middle of the iceberg now, the layer where you stop finding things in magazine profiles and start finding them in storyboard scans, forum threads, and lost media wikis kept up by people with an almost archival level of devotion. This is the material that takes real digging, so let us take it slowly. Start at the very beginning, before the franchise even existed in the form you know it. The original 1997 pilot, produced under the SpongeBob Ahoy working title, had different opening titles and credits from the version that eventually aired as the official pilot episode, Help Wanted. Footage and audio from this earlier cut did circulate publicly at the time, appearing on a 1998 home video release called Best of Nicktoons, but the original audio using the SpongeBob name specifically, the actual recorded dialogue from before the rename, is considered lost media by the people who track this sort of thing closely. It exists, presumably, somewhere, some archive, but nobody in the fan community currently has a copy they can point to. There is also a partial 1996 pitch Bible for the series that has surfaced online over the years, incomplete, missing pages, but offering a properly rare window into how Hillenburg framed the concept before Nickelodeon had committed to anything, back when it was still just a proposal on paper, rather than a diorama in an aquarium. The 2004 movie has its own quiet mystery attached to it. Material was cut or altered in the final theatrical edit, as happens with most feature films, but according to Lost Media Wiki documentation, some of that cut material has never resurfaced publicly in any form, neither as a deleted scenes reel, nor as a leaked work print. It simply is not available anywhere that anyone has found, which is a little unusual for a film with this much cultural footprint. Most movies this popular eventually leak a deleted scene or two. This one, apparently, has not. Some of the more specific deleted material is easier to pin down, as it survives in storyboard form even where the finished animation does not. Like the Season 2 episode, Procrastination. Storyboarded sequence, reportedly never animated into the final cut, is said to have shown SpongeBob after finally managing to write a line on his essay, looking out the window and watching jellyfish playing tennis along with other beach day activities happening outside while he is stuck at his desk. It is a small, purely atmospheric beat, the kind of joke that would have cost animation budget for very little narrative payoff, which is presumably why it did not survive to the final cut, but it is a nice glimpse of the specific, slightly whimsical background gags the writers were sketching out even for scenes that never made it to air. Nasty Patty, which I mentioned a moment ago in the context of its international bans, also went through a substantially different early version before reaching its aired form. Some fan accounts describe an early animatic for the episode with a different opening and ending, including a gag where SpongeBob supposedly hides the Nasty Patty down his own pants, though I cannot confirm that scene was ever actually produced or cut for that reason. And then there is Band Geeks, which might be the single episode with the most well-documented alternate history of any entry in this whole show. By some fan accounts, the episode went through an earlier working title before becoming Band Geeks, though I cannot confirm the details of that production history. Some fans also describe a planned appearance by a cousin of Squidward's that was cut before the episode aired, though I cannot confirm a character like that was ever actually written. And the ending, the marching band's climactic performance, the moment fans went on to quote and meme more than almost any other in the franchise's entire history, was not originally written the way it plays now. The band's big performance was originally scripted as competent, correct music, a band that simply plays well and wins the respect of the crowd through straightforward competence. Producers apparently found that underwhelming as a climax, and replaced it with something deliberately over the top and strange instead, the full theatrical rendition of Sweet Victory that fans would later, unsuccessfully, campaign to get performed at the Super Bowl, which I will come back to properly later in this descent. Though the single best-known needle drop in the show's history exists specifically because an earlier, safer, more competent version of the same scene was judged too boring to keep. That is a properly useful thing to know about comedy generally, not just about this one episode. The version that actually works is rarely the first version anyone writes down, and it is almost never the safest one on the page. Somebody in that writer's room had to look at a perfectly fine, perfectly competent musical performance and decide it needed to be worse, technically, off-key, too long, too sincere, before it could become the version people are still quoting decades later. One more from this same drawer, because I like it for how small and specific it is. In the original storyboarded version of the pilot, Help Wanted, Gary the Snail was going to take an on-screen bite out of a cactus. It never made the final cut, but it is worth knowing why the gag existed in the first place, because it connects back to Hillenburg's own scientific background. The show generally treats snails as Bikini Bottom's rough equivalent of house cats, giving Gary his meow, his general pet behavior, his role as a domestic companion, as a deliberate one-to-one substitution joke, rather than an arbitrary character quirk. The cactus bite gag tracks with an actual piece of garden biology. Real snails do in fact feed on succulent plants. But the cutscene was not just a random sight gag, it was a specific, accurate detail, rooted in the same kind of hands-on natural history knowledge that produced the sponge himself. Now for one of the odder censorship stories in the archive, one where the fix is almost funnier than the problem it was solving. The Season 2 episode Shanghai features a sequence called The Fly of Despair, a ghost story segment packed with skulls, skeletal remains, and a fairly heavy dose of properly demonic atmosphere for a children's show. Completely uncut in theaters, as a short played before feature films, and nobody involved apparently blinked at it in that context. But when it came time for the same sequence to air on television, the network judged it too scary for broadcast. Rather than cut the sequence entirely, the fix that made it to air is almost stranger than the original content. During Squidward's fall through the scene, the background art was swapped out for an incongruous image of spaghetti and meatballs, while the surrounding imagery, the skulls, horned creatures, all of it, stayed exactly as it was. So you end up with a moment that is still, technically, full of skeletal horror imagery, except for one frame where a plate of pasta is inexplicably hanging in the middle of it. Fix that solves absolutely nothing about the tone of the sequence, while technically satisfying whatever specific note the broadcast standards team had raised. International dubs of the cartoon diverge from each other in ways that go well beyond simple translation, and a few of these are worth knowing, because they show how differently the same scene can land depending on which country is airing it. By some fan accounts, the Croatian dub gave its version of the French narrator a distinct regional accent for a stretch of early seasons, before quietly dropping that choice in a later season, though I cannot confirm the specifics of that claim. Canadian French dub took an even stranger path. Fans of the Canadian French dub say its narrator was voiced by the same performer for many seasons, and that after his passing the production kept reusing his previously recorded audio, rather than recasting the role, though I have not been able to confirm that account myself. And in a smaller, quieter example of the same general pattern, both the Russian dub and the European Spanish dub have the French narrator simply not cry in scenes where he audibly does in the English original. Small emotional beats softened or removed entirely depending on which broadcast market you happen to be watching from. None of these dub-level changes get decided by the cartoon's original creative team back in the United States, as far as I can tell. They are local decisions, made by local studios adapting the material for local audiences, sometimes for straightforward linguistic reasons, sometimes, as with the Russian and Spanish narrator no longer crying, for reasons that look a little more like cultural comfort, with a certain kind of emotional display on screen. Multiply choices like that across every language this show has ever been dubbed into, and you end up with dozens of subtly different versions of the same 27-year-old franchise, each one shaped just slightly differently by whoever happened to be sitting in the recording booth translating it. Let me close this layer with the numbers, because ratings are their own strange little archive, and this show's biggest nights are, somewhat surprisingly, not recent ones. By most fan-tallied accounts, the most watched SpongeBob episode or special in the franchise's history, measured in Nielsen ratings, is Atlantis SquarePants, which aired in November of 2007 and reportedly drew one of the largest audiences of any premiere in Nickelodeon's history, not just for this show. Second place for the show specifically reportedly belongs to Dunces and Dragons, which aired in early 2006 to a similarly large audience. Notice the pattern there. Two single biggest ratings nights this franchise has ever had both happened in the mid-2000s, comfortably before the current season count even reached double digits. Whatever the show is doing now, 17 seasons and 330-plus episodes deep, has never quite matched the raw audience size it pulled in during that particular stretch, roughly 2 decades ago now. Part of that is simply how television consumption has changed underneath the cartoon's feet. Live linear ratings meant something different in 2007 than they mean now, with so much of the audience watching on demand, on streaming platforms, and clips shared secondhand rather than tuning in on the night an episode actually premieres. So I would not read too much decline into those particular numbers on their own. It is less that the franchise became less popular, and more that the entire concept of a single Tuesday night broadcast audience has simply stopped being how most people of any age actually watch television at all. So, we are staying in the middle layer for a while longer, because this next stretch is really the heart of what makes an iceberg like this fun to build in the first place. Contradictions. Every long-running show accumulates them. Small inconsistencies that pile up once you have 330 episodes written by dozens of different people over 27 years. And this show has a particularly well-cataloged set of them, thanks to how thoroughly its fan wikis track continuity. Start with the Krusty Krab's origin, which is worth walking through slowly, since the popular internet framing of it gets the shape of the contradiction wrong. We'll often hear it described as a clean, two-version contradiction, one origin story flatly canceling out another. That is not really an accurate description of what the series has actually done. There are, properly counted, at least 3 distinct tellings scattered across different episodes, and only one of them actually addresses the origin of the building itself. Season 3's Krusty Krab training video establishes that the building was originally a bankrupt retirement home called the Rusty Krab, which Mr. Krabs, freshly retired from a military background, apparently a little depressed about it, bought and rebranded, largely by just repainting the first letter of the sign from an R to a K. That one is a building origin story. Full stop. Season 6's Grandpappy the Pirate is a different kind of story entirely. It reveals that Krabs once owned and personally captained a pirate ship, which he sold off when he retired from that life. That is personal history, about Krabs the individual, not about the restaurant's structure. In fact, in that very same episode, Krabs dresses the restaurant up with props specifically to make it look like a ship, purely to fool his own grandfather, which rather undercuts any literal reading where the building itself simply is that old ship. And Season 5's Friend or Foe covers still a third kind of history, the shared past between Krabs and Plankton, both of whom apparently got their start in the food business together after an earlier venture called Stinky's Burgers closed down, before their partnership dissolved into the rivalry that defines the whole show. Properly separated like this, these are not really 3 contradictory answers to one question. They are 3 different questions: the building's origin, Krabs' personal past, and the Krabs and Plankton business history, that happen to have gotten flattened together into a single the show contradicts itself narrative online. Once you separate the layers, the appearance of contradiction mostly dissolves, though I will admit there is something fitting about a restaurant this central to the show's mythology having its history told in 3 completely different registers depending on which episode happens to be telling it. Long-running institutions do this constantly, in fiction and outside it. Ask 3 people who have worked somewhere for decades how the place actually started, and you will usually get 3 different, only partially overlapping stories, not because anyone is lying, but because a building accumulates more history than any single account can hold, and each person telling it reaches for whichever thread happens to matter most to them personally. Krusty Krab getting 3 separate origin stories across 3 separate seasons is not really a continuity failure in that light. It is closer to how actual oral history works, messy, personal, and only ever partially reconciled, dressed up in a cartoon restaurant instead of a family business or an old corner bar. Krabby Patty formula has its own tangle of inconsistencies, and this one, I think, genuinely is a contradiction, not just an apparent one. Its hiding place moves around from episode to episode without the cartoon ever settling on a single answer. Sometimes it lives in a safe or vault inside the restaurant itself, sealed inside a small glass bottle. Other times, specifically in Plankton's army and in The Lost Mattress, it is kept under Mr. Krabs' own mattress at home. The franchise never reconciles which of these is the actual default hiding spot, and honestly, at this point, 27 years in, probably never will. The ingredients have their own layer of inconsistency stacked on top of that. One version of the formula, revealed on screen, reportedly lists a set of whimsical joke ingredients, including a jab aimed directly at Plankton, a bit that fans say the very next episode's continuity simply ignores entirely, though it never happened. Elsewhere, in Friend or Foe, and again in Call the Cops, the formula is described as including chum, which sits awkwardly against the franchise's general framing and Nickelodeon's own public statements that Krabby Patties are essentially meatless. And in the episode Krabby Road, the ingredient list shown on screen is not readable at all, just a string of gibberish letters standing in for real text. Show artist and writer Vincent Waller has actually stated on the record that this particular gibberish is deliberate, a specific choice to make sure the audience can never actually read the real ingredients, whatever they might be. So that one, at least, is not a slip. It is a wall built on purpose, right in the middle of an otherwise genuinely inconsistent pile of contradictory reveals. Here is a smaller, stranger one, tucked into the show's very first attempt at time travel. In the Season 1 episode SB-129, Squidward gets frozen inside the Krusty Krab's walk-in freezer for 2,000 years. It is a fun premise, and the future Squidward wakes up into is suitably strange. But fans and wiki analysts have pointed out a fairly basic logic problem sitting underneath the joke. That freezer is a working restaurant appliance. Over 2,000 years, someone, presumably, would have needed to open it for supplies at some point, which never happens on screen, and which the episode simply never addresses. It is the kind of hole that only opens up if you think about the premise for longer than the joke was ever designed to survive, which is, admittedly, exactly what an iceberg chart like this one exists to do. There is a stranger footnote here too, a 44th century future glimpsed later, and a sequence from the SpongeBob movie video game called The Pool of Perception bears a resemblance to the future setting from that same SB-129 episode, which raises an unresolved question fans still debate: whether the show's various depictions of the far future across television and games are meant to represent the same shared timeline, or are simply recycling similar visual ideas without any intent to connect them. My own honest guess, and I want to flag clearly that this is a guess rather than anything close to a sourced claim. The second option, video game tie-ins and the main television series are usually produced by largely separate teams, working on separate schedules, often years apart, and visual echoes between two futuristic settings are just as likely to come from two different artists, reaching for the same handful of obvious science fiction shorthand, floating platforms, strange lighting, everything a little too shiny, as they are to come from any deliberate attempt to build a single connected timeline across a cartoon and its licensed video game. Now for one of the cleaner cases in this whole layer, a theory the studio itself actually stepped in and killed outright, rather than leaving it to simmer indefinitely online the way most dark fan theories get left to do. For years, a persistent fan theory held that Krabby Patties are secretly made from actual crab meat, which would make Mr. Krabs, the crab himself, functionally a cannibal serving his own species to paying customers, a theory partly fueled by treating the fictional ingredient King Neptune's Poseidon powder as a wink towards something illicit. In 2017, Nickelodeon's own official social media account addressed this directly, stating plainly that it could, in the network's own phrasing, 100% confirm Krabby Patties are not made of crabs. Hillenburg had separately described the patties as effectively vegan within the cartoon's own internal logic. So this is a rare case where the studio did not simply let ambiguity stand. It went out of its way, publicly, to shut a specific dark theory down. Tells you something about how seriously Nickelodeon apparently took the idea that people believed their flagship crustacean character was secretly a cannibal. Notice how rare this kind of intervention actually is across the rest of tonight's chart. Nearly everything else in this middle layer, the formula's hiding place, the Krusty Krab's overlapping origin stories, SpongeBob's own unresolved age, which I will get to shortly, gets left alone by the studio to sit in permanent ambiguity, because ambiguity in a long-running cartoon usually costs nothing and occasionally gives the fandom something to argue about for free. Crab meat theory apparently crossed some line the others did not, dark enough or repeated often enough that somebody at the network decided a direct denial was worth issuing publicly, rather than just letting it keep circulating the way everything else on this chart has been allowed to. Two smaller ones to round out this layer, both purely geographic, both the kind of detail you would only catch by watching very closely and comparing episodes against each other. In the earliest episodes, Help Wanted, Plankton, and Lost in Bikini Bottom among them, SpongeBob walks to the right of his pineapple house to get to work at the Krusty Krab. In almost every episode made after that early run, he goes left instead. Nobody in the writer's room ever addressed the change on screen. It is simply baked into the franchise's own background art, a small, persistent geography retcon that most viewers would never notice unless someone pointed it out to them directly, which is, admittedly, exactly what I am doing right now. And in that same early episode, Lost in Bikini Bottom, there is a background site gag worth knowing about, a competing restaurant called the Krabby Crust, whose sign is drawn to closely resemble the actual Krusty Krab sign, close enough that SpongeBob himself briefly mistakes one for the other. It is a small, easily missed joke about just how replaceable and generic the Krusty Krab's own branding actually looks from a distance, buried in the background of a single episode and never referenced again. That is the contradiction layer. I think what it mostly proves is not that the series is sloppy. Exactly. Though there is some genuine sloppiness in there, the formula's hiding place especially. It proves that a show running this long, written by this many different hands across this many years, was never going to hold together as one single, perfectly consistent document. Some of the seams are accidental. Some, like the gibberish ingredient list, are deliberately built into the show on purpose. Holes left open by design, rather than by oversight. Telling those two categories apart is most of what this layer of the iceberg is actually for. Alright, we are heading down into the lower part of the chart now, the part most fan-built icebergs reserve for the material that is harder to verify, harder to sit comfortably with, or simply harder to find at all. I want to slow down a little here, not because anything that follows is going to be shocking exactly, but because this is exactly the layer where sloppy sourcing does the most damage, where a rumor repeated 3 times starts to feel like a fact. So I am going to keep being careful about labeling what is confirmed, what is not, maybe more carefully than anywhere else in tonight's descent, because down here, the distinction actually matters. Start with the piece of the show's own mythology that is not, strictly, part of the cartoon at all. Around 2010, on a message board called 7chan, specifically on its /x/paranormal section, someone posted a piece of horror fiction that has since become the best-known creepypasta associated with this franchise, generally known as Squidward's Suicide. It is worth being completely clear about what this actually is. It is fan-made fiction, not a real unaired episode or a lost broadcast, nothing the cartoon's actual production ever intended to air. The story splices together real clips from the franchise with unsettling music and deliberately disorienting editing, wrapped in false narration claiming a genuine lost episode drove Squidward to take his own life with a shotgun. None of that happened. There was no such episode. It is a piece of internet horror fiction, effectively fan fiction, with a very dark premise, built to feel like leaked television, because that presentation format is scarier than a story that admits what it actually is up front. Here is the part that makes it worth including in tonight's descent, rather than dismissing outright, though. The show itself, the real production, briefly acknowledged the creepypasta on air. In the episode SpongeBob in Random Land, a version of Squidward with glowing red eyes appears briefly as a jump scare cameo, clear, deliberate wink at the creepypasta's iconography for anyone in the audience who already knew the fan story. Then, after that reference, drew attention, and presumably after some internal conversation about whether referencing a piece of suicide-themed horror fiction in a children's show was actually a good idea, the moment was edited out and replaced with an unrelated gag involving a baby version of Squidward instead. So you end up with a small, oddly precise loop. Fan horror fiction bleeds into the actual canon as a wink. The wink draws attention. The wink gets quietly scrubbed and replaced. It is a properly rare case of a show acknowledging a piece of fan-created mythology about itself, and then, on reflection, taking that acknowledgement back. Both halves of that story matter equally. Leave out the first half and you understate how deep this piece of internet folklore actually reached into the show's own production. Leave out the second half, and you make the series sound far more comfortable referencing suicide imagery than it actually turned out to be, once the reference had already aired and drawn a reaction. Now for something considerably heavier, considerably more real, because this next part is not internet folklore at all. Stephen Hillenburg announced in March of 2017 that he had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, a progressive neurological condition that gradually affects a person's ability to control their own muscles. He made the announcement himself, saying at the time that he wanted people to hear the news directly from him rather than through second-hand reporting, which tells you something about how he chose to handle even a diagnosis this serious, on his own terms, in his own words. He continued to be involved with the cartoon, and with the second theatrical movie, for as long as his health allowed him to be. He died on the 26th of November, 2018, at 57 years old, from complications related to the disease. I want to keep those two dates separate and precise, as it is easy, in casual retelling, to blur an announcement and a death into one vague moment, and they are not the same event. The diagnosis came first, publicly, nearly 2 years before the end. The franchise's creator spent those final years still working, still present, for as much of that stretch as his body would allow him to be. I think about that timeline a fair amount, the choice to announce a diagnosis like that publicly, on his own terms, rather than let it leak out through industry gossip or a studio press release once he was no longer able to work at all. It is a small act of authorship over his own story, and a career built entirely around authoring stories for other people to watch. A marine biologist who spent a decade teaching children about tide pools, who built a diorama and wheeled it into a pitch meeting under a bedsheet, who spent the rest of his life more or less steadily protecting a show he had originally only ever wanted to make for 3 seasons, choosing to tell his own hardest piece of news himself, plainly, before anyone else could tell a version of it for him. What happened a few months after his death is worth dwelling on too, as it is one of the largest, strangest expressions of fan affection I have come across researching any of these deep dive scripts. Remember Band Geeks, from the earlier layer of this descent, and its climactic sweet victory performance, the sequence that only exists in its famous, over-the-top form because an earlier, more competent version of the same scene was judged too boring to keep. In the weeks leading up to Super Bowl Lee, in early 2019, just months after Hillenburg's death, over 1 million people signed a petition asking the halftime performer, Maroon 5, to perform Sweet Victory live, as a tribute. It did not happen. The only SpongeBob material that actually made it into the broadcast was a brief clip used to introduce Travis Scott's cameo appearance during the halftime show. Nothing close to the full tribute performance so many people had asked for. It is a strange kind of data point. Over 1 million people organizing around a specific piece of music from a cartoon, reaching all the way up to National Football League scale visibility, and still, in the end, coming up short of what they were actually asking for. I find it a little sad and a little sweet at the same time, less because of what was lost, and more because of what it says about how much organized affection this particular sequence, from this particular episode, had accumulated in the years since it first aired. A halftime show only has room for 1 act, and the NFL owed this fandom nothing, obviously, but there is still something worth turning over in the fact that the ask itself, over 1 million individual people, coordinated enough to sign one petition, aimed at one specific piece of music from one specific children's cartoon, happened at all. Most grief does not organize itself that visibly. This particular grief did, briefly, before it went right back to being the private, ordinary kind everyone else's grief usually stays as. Now into the deepest part of tonight's chart, the section where I need to draw the sharpest possible line between what the show has actually stated and what fans have simply decided to believe, because a few of the internet's favorite dark SpongeBob theories live down here, and none of them are confirmed. The first of these circulates more widely than any of the others. Bikini Bottom, the setting of the entire show, sits underneath a real-world location, Bikini Atoll, in the Marshall Islands, which really was the site of 23 American nuclear weapons tests during the Cold War. That naming connection is confirmed. Tom Kenny himself has publicly reaffirmed, more than once, that Bikini Bottom's name is a direct reference to Bikini Atoll. What is not confirmed is the darker extension fans have built on top of that naming reference, the idea that the residents of Bikini Bottom are secretly mutated, irradiated survivors of those actual historical nuclear tests, their cheerful cartoon appearances hiding some kind of grim biological backstory underneath. That mutation storyline has never been stated as canon by Hillenburg, by any showrunner, or by the network. It is an extrapolation fans have built from a real naming reference, and a fairly clever one as extrapolations go, but it stays a theory, not lore. I want to keep those two claims, the naming reference and the mutation backstory, firmly separated from each other, because only one of them is actually true. The second lives in roughly the same territory. Popular theory, the kind that shows up regularly in dark theory listicles online, holds that SpongeBob is, in some sense, dead, and that the entire show depicts him trapped in a kind of purgatorial or Sisyphean loop, reliving some version of the same day forever, cheerful on the surface while something considerably bleaker sits underneath. It is an evocative reading. I understand the appeal of it. There is something about the show's relentless repetition, the eternal shifts at the Krusty Krab, the friendships that never actually develop or change across hundreds of episodes, that lends itself naturally to that kind of interpretation. But it has zero creator confirmation behind it. None. It is pure fan reading, built entirely from atmosphere and repetition rather than anything stated on screen or in an interview. I think it is worth enjoying as exactly that, an interpretation, rather than mistaking it for something the franchise is actually trying to tell you. And the third, a little lighter than the other two but built the same way, maps each of the cartoon's main characters onto one of the 7 deadly sins. Krabs for greed, obviously, Plankton for envy, Squidward for wrath, Patrick for gluttony, and so on down the list, depending on which version of the mapping you come across. It is a tidy piece of pattern matching, the kind fans enjoy building, because the series does lean heavily on exaggerated, singular character flaws as its main comedic engine, but Hillenburg never confirmed it. No showrunner since has confirmed it, and it exists purely as an audience-imposed structure laid over characters who were written as jokes first and symbols only by accident, if at all. That is the bottom of tonight's descent, or close to it. What I keep noticing about this particular layer, how differently each piece of material earns its place down here. The creepypasta earns it because the show itself blinked, referenced it, then took the reference back. Hillenburg's death earns it simply because it is heavy, not because it is hidden. Everybody who follows the show at all already knows the broad shape of that story, and the 3 theories earn their place down here because they are, each of them, built on something real, a naming reference, a repetitive structure, a cast of exaggerated flaws, stretched out into a darker shape than the cartoon itself has ever actually confirmed. Down here, more than anywhere else in this chart, the honest answer to most questions simply, we do not actually know, and probably never will. There is one more block to go before the very bottom of the trench, and it belongs down here specifically because it involves the franchise's name and reputation being dragged, without its consent, into subjects that have nothing to do with a sponge who lives in a pineapple. Start with the ugliest of these, because it is worth stating plainly and then closing the door on properly. For years, a conspiracy theory has circulated online claiming that the home address shown on SpongeBob's driver's license, visible on screen in the episode No Free Rides, somehow matches the real-world coordinates of Little St. James, private island once owned by Jeffrey Epstein. It sounds, on its face, like exactly the kind of unsettling coincidence the internet loves to seize on and refuse to let go of. It has also been independently fact-checked and debunked, not once, but at least 3 separate times, by Snopes, by PolitiFact, and by Lead Stories. The actual explanation traces back to something almost comically mundane. As best as the fact-checkers pieced it together, it traced back to a spoofed or mislabeled listing that had somehow gotten attached to those map coordinates, one that was eventually removed once people started flagging it. The fictional address on a cartoon character's fictional driver's license has no genuine connection to Epstein's actual island at all. I mention it here not because there is anything left to investigate. There is not. But because it is a useful example of exactly the kind of thing this whole lower layer of the iceberg has to guard against. A coincidence, dressed up with just enough specificity to feel like evidence, that collapses the moment anyone actually checks the underlying claim. Fictional addresses, fictional birth dates, fictional formulas, all of it invites this same kind of overreading eventually. Given enough time and enough people staring at the same handful of frames, looking for a pattern that was never actually built into them on purpose. Most of the time, as with this one, the mundane explanation turns out to be a spoofed map listing rather than anything worth losing sleep over, which is a reasonably comforting thing to remember at this particular hour, whatever your own version of a 3 a.m. conspiracy spiral tends to look like. Now for something that is not a conspiracy at all, but a genuine, ongoing, real-world story, and I want to flag clearly that this one is current, not historical, because it is easy to assume a show this old only has censorship stories from decades past. As of this year, the Russian broadcaster known as 2x2 has been digitally altering a specific scene in which SpongeBob describes the fun of imagination, replacing a rainbow effect that appears on screen with a plain, solid yellow arc instead. It is widely understood, by outlets covering the story, as compliance with Russia's law against what the government there terms LGBTQ plus propaganda, a law broad enough that a children's cartoon depicting a rainbow apparently falls under its scope. Separately, and through a different mechanism entirely, Ukraine's National Expert Commission for Protecting Public Morality has formally labeled the franchise a real threat to children and pushed for it to be pulled from Ukrainian television altogether, citing alleged homoeroticism in a campaign unconnected to the specific Russian broadcast edit but aimed at the same underlying anxiety about the show's content. Put those two together, and you get a small but actively live illustration of something worth thinking about for a moment, that a franchise old enough to have outlived its own creator, still, in real time, this year, becoming a flashpoint in entirely new censorship battles it never asked to be part of. One more from this same drawer, quieter than the last two but worth knowing, because it involves a false claim doing real damage to something that did not deserve it. Camp Coral, the prequel spin-off, imagining a younger version of the cast at summer camp, premiered in 2021 and was cancelled on the 10th of July, 2024. Officially, the cancellation came down to the show always having been planned as a limited series, compounded by fairly minimal advertising and broader cost-cutting happening across Paramount at the time. But before that quiet, unremarkable ending, the series endured a coordinated review-bombing campaign across IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, and Metacritic, driven by a claim that turned out to be false, that Hillenburg had personally opposed the very idea of spin-offs, and that Camp Coral therefore disrespected his legacy simply by existing. The actual record does not support that. Hillenburg reportedly knew about and was aware of the spin-off's development before his death in 2018, so a show got publicly punished, in review scores and public sentiment, for supposedly betraying a dead man's wishes he likely never actually held, at least not in the specific way the campaign against it claimed. Worth noting, as a point of contrast, that the other spin-off launched that same year, The Patrick Star Show, had a considerably gentler path, earning a second season renewal in 2022, which makes the two spin-offs a useful small case study in how differently the same network and the same fandom can treat two shows that started life under almost identical circumstances. That is properly the bottom of the trench, as far as tonight's chart goes. I want to bring us back up, not all the way to the surface, but up into a lighter, stranger band of material I did not have anywhere else to put. Shelf of facts about just how much craft and stubborn attention actually went into this franchise once you look at the parts nobody watching casually would ever think to check. If The Abyss was about grief and rumor and things the cartoon would rather not have said out loud, this last stretch is about the opposite instinct. People spending an unreasonable amount of effort on a cartoon about a sponge, on purpose, because they wanted to. Take the stage musical. SpongeBob SquarePants, the Broadway musical, opened, and in 2018 it picked up 12 Tony Award nominations, including a nomination for Ethan Slater, who played SpongeBob, for Best Leading Actor in a Musical, and a nomination for Best Original Score. 12 nominations tied it, that season, with Mean Girls for the most of any show up for the prize. What makes the score particularly strange, in a good way, is who actually wrote it. Rather than commissioning one Broadway composer to handle the whole thing, the production pulled together an oddly eclectic roster of outside pop musicians, each contributing songs. John Legend wrote for it. So did the country group Lady Antebellum. Panic at the Disco contributed a song called Just a Simple Sponge Reprise. Steven Tyler and Joe Perry of Aerosmith wrote for it. So did Sarah Bareilles, The Flaming Lips, and Cyndi Lauper. It is a properly strange lineup to see credited on a single cast recording, a roster that would look more at home on a music festival poster than a playbill. And the fact that it holds together at all as a coherent musical, let alone one nominated for a dozen Tony Awards, says something about how much care went into stitching all those disparate voices into one show. Video games have their own quiet archive of restored material worth knowing about, and the clearest example is Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, a 2020 remake of the original 2003 platformer. Rather than simply reskinning the original game with better graphics, the remake's developers went back and restored previously cut content from the original production into a new multiplayer mode, including a scrapped boss fight against a robotic version of Squidward that never made it into the original release, an abandoned dream sequence involving Patrick that had been cut from the first game, a cut phase of the final battle against Robo SpongeBob that had also been left on the cutting room floor 2 decades earlier. So this franchise's lost content archive is not limited to television footage. It includes lost video game material too, sitting unused for the better part of 2 decades before someone finally decided it was worth digging back out and finishing properly. The remake got fairly mixed reviews from critics on release, for what it is worth, but it was a clear commercial success regardless, selling more than 2 million copies. Zoom out to the full award tally, and the picture gets a little more complicated, in an interesting way. Across its entire history, this franchise has accumulated a genuinely enormous pile of award nominations and wins by most tallies, including a healthy handful of Emmy nominations and wins specifically for the flagship series. That is a properly respectable haul for any television show. It falls well short, though, of the record actually held by The Simpsons, which by most tallies holds the record for the most primetime Emmy wins of any animated series in history. Though SpongeBob is, by any reasonable measure, a major awards player, a show that wins constantly and consistently, but it is worth being precise that it is not the record holder some casual fans assume it to be. The two shows occupy different tiers of the same category, and conflating them does a disservice to how much The Simpsons specifically has racked up over its own considerably longer run. I think the confusion happens honestly enough, though. Both shows have been on the air long enough, and won often enough, that at a certain point the specific tallies stop mattering to most casual viewers and both franchises just register, generally, as the kind of animated show that wins things. Precision matters to an iceberg chart like this one specifically, because precision is the entire point of going to this much trouble in the first place. If I am not going to bother getting the exact number right, there is not much reason to be building a chart, instead of just repeating whatever the last video I watched about this show happened to claim. For anyone who wants to actually look at the art, rather than just hear about it described secondhand, there is a proper primary source worth knowing about. Edu Publishing released an official art book called SpongeBob SquarePants, The Art of an Undersea World, written by the animation historian Tracy Miller Zarnicki, running past 350 pages and collecting concept art, finished production art, and storyboards spanning more than 25 years of the franchise's development. It goes considerably deeper than an earlier book on the same general subject, SpongeBob SquarePants Experience, published back in 2013 by animation historian Jerry Beck, which covered similar ground but at nowhere near the same scale or depth. If you ever wanted to actually trace the visual lineage from Hillenburg's own Intertidal Zone Tidepool illustrations, the ones I mentioned right back at the start of tonight's descent, through to the finished character designs you know today, a book like that is where the paper trail actually lives. There is something quite touching about the existence of a book that thick built around a franchise this determinedly silly, hundreds of pages of concept sketches and revised character models and storyboard panels, treated with the same archival seriousness a museum might give a much more self-consciously prestigious animated film. The franchise never asked to be taken that seriously. It has ended up being taken that seriously anyway, at least by the people who make books like this one, simply because enough time and enough labor has gone into its production that the underlying art was always going to be worth preserving properly, whether or not the finished cartoon itself ever aimed for that kind of prestige in the first place. In the newest chapter of the franchise, at least as of tonight, the theatrical release from this past December, the SpongeBob movie, Search for SquarePants, notable partly for casting Mark Hamill as the voice of the Flying Dutchman. It grossed roughly $165 million worldwide, which sounds like a substantial number in isolation, until you set it next to Sponge Out of Water, the 2015 film, which brought in more than double that amount a decade earlier. Critically, though, the newer film actually did quite well, landing an 80% fresh score on Rotten Tomatoes. Put those two facts side by side, and you get a small, slightly bittersweet picture of where this franchise sits theatrically right now. A series that critics still seem to actually enjoy, paired with box office returns that have been trending steadily downward even as the reviews stay solid, which is not a combination that bodes especially well for how many more of these theatrical releases we should expect to see. Let me close this shelf with a few pieces of pure design trivia, the kind of thing that rewards knowing a little marine biology going in, because Hillenburg's scientific background, the same background that produced Bob the Sponge and the Intertidal Zone comic all those years ago, keeps resurfacing in small, deliberate jokes throughout the show's visual design. Bikini Bottom treats clams and scallops as its rough equivalent of birds, which sounds like an arbitrary cartoon substitution until you learn that real scallops can actually swim, propelling themselves through the water by rapidly clapping their two shells together, which makes the bird substitution a properly accurate piece of marine biology, dressed up as a sight gag, rather than a random choice. In the episode The Algae's Always Greener, Plankton eats something called holographic meatloaf, a joke that sounds purely nonsensical until you remember that actual plankton, the real microscopic organisms, generate their energy through photosynthesis, meaning a meal made of pure light is not a random joke at all. It is a coherent biological pun for a character who is, on some level, meant to be photosynthetic himself. Squidward's house, the one wedged between SpongeBob's pineapple and Patrick's rock, is modeled directly on a moai, the carved monolithic head statues of Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island, a specific, named piece of real-world anthropology sitting quietly in the background of nearly every establishing shot of the neighborhood, doing double duty as a joke about Squidward's own self-regard and as an actual, deliberate architectural reference. Before we surface all the way, there is a promise from earlier in tonight's descent I still need to pay off. Right back near the beginning, when I first ran through the main cast, I mentioned that Tom Kenny does considerably more voice work on this show than most casual viewers ever clock, and I said we would get into that later. Here we are, later. Beyond SpongeBob himself, Kenny also voices Gary the Snail, meaning every one of Gary's meows is coming from the same actor playing the sponge who owns him. He also voices Patchy the Pirate, a live-action framing device character who hosts various specials, and he voices the recurring French narrator, the Dry, formal voice that periodically interrupts episodes to describe events in an exaggerated nature documentary register. Some fan researchers digging through storyboard documents for the original pilot episode, Help Wanted, claim that narrator character carried a working name before he was simply called the French narrator, a placeholder nodding to the real-world oceanographer, though it is the kind of production footnote that is hard to pin down for certain. So a fair portion of the show's non-SpongeBob vocal texture, family pet, the framing device host, the narrator interrupting to describe a school of fish with mock seriousness, all traces back to one man, sitting in a booth, cycling between 4 or 5 distinct voices across a single recording session. Here is a smaller, more technical piece of production trivia, the kind that mostly circulates on dedicated fan forums rather than mainstream coverage, but worth including, as it corrects a fairly common misconception. Rough Draft Korea, the studio that has long handled the cartoon's actual animation work, is often assumed by fans to have switched over to the industry-standard software Toon Boom Harmony sometime around Season 4. Forum research digging directly into production footage suggests that is not quite right. By some accounts, the studio was actually still using a different program for a good while longer, only migrating to Toon Boom Harmony later, the popular fan timeline usually claims. It is a small correction, one that only matters if you happen to care about animation software history specifically, but it is a good reminder that even fairly confident, widely repeated fan trivia can turn out to be slightly off once someone actually goes back and checks the underlying footage frame by frame. And now, the piece of upper layer trivia I think matters more than almost anything else in tonight's whole descent, because it reframes basically everything that came after it. Stephen Hillenburg's original plan for this show was never for it to run 17 seasons, or 27 years, or past 330 episodes. His reported intent, and I should stress that this is the creator's stated plan rather than something confirmed inside the franchise's own fiction, was for the series to run 3 seasons, and to end there. The 2004 theatrical film serving as a kind of capstone, a series finale dressed up as a movie rather than a normal broadcast episode. Nickelodeon, seeing how well that film performed, pushed back against that plan, and asked for more episodes anyway. Production restarted for a 4th season. From that point forward, the franchise simply never stopped growing again. Every season since Season 3, all 14 of them and counting, every sequel film, every spin-off series, all of it exists specifically because the network overruled its own creator's original stopping point. I do not think that makes any of what came after fraudulent. Exactly. Some of the strongest material in the cartoon's whole history, Band Geeks included, aired well after that original 3-season plan would have wrapped things up. But it does mean that the vast majority of this franchise, by episode count alone, is essentially bonus content, made against the wishes of the person who built the whole thing in the first place. I find that a strange thing to carry into everything else we have covered tonight. Every fact from the middle and lower layers of this chart, contradictions, the censorship battles, creepypasta reference, the awards, all of it happened inside a stretch of the show's history that, according to its own creator's original intentions, was never supposed to exist at all. Do not say that to diminish any of it, to be clear. Creators' original intentions are not automatically the correct or final version of a work, no matter how much weight fans sometimes give them after the fact. Plenty of long-running fiction improves, or at least evolves into something worth watching on its own terms, well past whatever the person who started it originally had in mind. But it does change how I think about the phrase Hillenburg's vision, which gets thrown around constantly in fan discussions as though it describes something fixed. A single blueprint the show has either honored or betrayed, depending on which season you happen to be talking about. Actual vision, the one he pitched with a diorama under a sheet, ran 3 seasons and stopped. Everything past that point, a different, ongoing negotiation between a network's commercial interests and whichever writers happened to be in the room at the time, which is, if you think about it for more than a moment, closer to how most long-running television actually gets made than the tidy singular vision narrative fans generally prefer to imagine. One last small piece before we come all the way back up. SpongeBob's own age, appropriately for a character this deliberately elastic, refuses to settle into a single number no matter how closely you look. His driver's license has actually been shown on screen twice, once in the Season 1 episode Sleepy Time, and again later in No Free Rides, and both times it lists the same birth date, the 14th of July, 1986, taken completely literally against the franchise's original broadcast dates. That would put him at somewhere around 13 or 14 years old during the earliest seasons, which does not remotely match how he is drawn or how he behaves in half the cartoon's episodes. Hillenburg himself once joked, separately, that SpongeBob is 50 in sponge years, a deliberately unhelpful answer that raises more questions than it resolves. The itself never tries to reconcile any of this. It simply flips him between implied teenager, whenever a boating school joke needs him young and incompetent, and implied adult, whenever a career or midlife crisis plot needs him old enough to be jaded, depending entirely on which version serves the joke being told that week. His age was never meant to be solved. It was built, on purpose, to stay permanently, comfortably unresolved. I want to end tonight's descent by stepping back from any single fact and looking at the chart itself for a moment, because the existence of an iceberg like this one is, I think, its own small piece of evidence worth taking seriously. Fan communities have built these layered charts for a great many shows over the years, but the ones dedicated specifically to this franchise are unusually large and unusually well maintained. One widely circulated chart focused purely on lost and cut content runs past 118 separate entries. Another, a broader effort sometimes nicknamed Supreme SpongeBob by the fans who assembled it, runs past 200. Compare that to the charts built for most other Nickelodeon properties from the same era, shows with similarly long runs and similarly large audiences, and you will generally find something thinner, a few dozen entries at most, often padded out with speculation because there simply is not enough verifiable material to fill a proper chart. This show does not have that problem. It has the opposite problem, an actual surplus of documented trivia, deleted scenes, casting footnotes, and international variations, more than any single video, including this one, could ever hope to cover completely. Some of that surplus, I think, traces back to the specific creative lineage the show grew out of. Hillenburg did not build his crew from scratch. Coming off Rocko's Modern Life, he brought several people from that earlier production directly onto SpongeBob with him, carrying over habits and jokes and a particular sensibility about how to write jokes for kids that also worked, on a second and third viewing, for adults watching along. That inherited sensibility is part of why the show rewards this kind of close, repeated attention in the first place. It was never built purely as disposable children's programming, the kind of show you watch once and move on from. It was built by people who had already spent years learning how to hide a second, subtler layer of joke underneath the obvious one, and that habit is precisely what gives an iceberg chart like tonight's something real to dig through, rather than just surface-level plot summaries stretched thin. There is also, I think, something to be said for the sheer amount of time involved. 27 years is long enough for a show to accumulate not one generation of close, obsessive fans, but 2 or 3, each one arriving with slightly different tools. Early fans traded VH's recordings and message board posts. A later wave built wikis, cross-referencing episode transcripts against interview quotes with an almost academic rigor. The newest wave has search engines, archived social media posts, and full-length oral history pieces from outlets that did not even exist when the cartoon premiered. All of it searchable in ways that simply were not possible for the fans who came before them. Each generation adds a layer the previous one did not have access to. And a chart like tonight's really just a snapshot of everything those overlapping generations have managed to surface so far. Not a finished, permanent document, but something still actively being added to, quietly, a little at a time, by people who were not even alive when the earliest episodes first aired. So that is the lot, more or less. We have come all the way down from the surface, past the upper layer of pitch meetings and casting rooms, through the middle stretch of deleted scenes and contradictions the franchise never bothered resolving, down into the trench where the creepypasta and the grief and the disputed theories live, and back up again into this last shelf of production trivia and fan archaeology before closing the chart entirely. If you drifted off somewhere along the way, at the freezer in SB-129, or during the Croatian dub, or somewhere around the Moai statue wedged between a pineapple and a rock, that is completely fine. Nothing back there was building toward this moment. You have not missed a single thing that mattered, because nothing in tonight's script was ever waiting on you to stay awake for it. At this hour, whatever hour it actually is wherever you happen to be listening from, I think the honest thing to say about a franchise like this one is not some tidy lesson about resilience or creativity or found family, though you could probably construct any of those readings if you wanted to. I do not think the series hands you a moral like that. Not really. And I would rather not force one onto it just to give tonight a neat ending. What I keep coming back to instead, turning all of this over one more time, how much of what makes this particular show endure was never actually planned. The pitch was closer to street theater than a business proposal. The villain's voice used to be the hero's audition tape, a stage musical held together despite being stitched from a roster of songwriters who had no obvious business sharing a soundtrack. The creator who wanted 3 seasons and a clean ending got, instead, 3 decades and counting, most of it made without him, some of it made in spite of his own original wishes, and somehow the whole unplanned. Overgrown thing still mostly works, still funny, and is apparently still watched by more people worldwide than nearly any other children's show, by whatever metric Guinness used to calculate that. There is something almost accidental about how well it has all held together, and for my money, that accidental quality is closer to the actual reason people keep coming back to it than any tidier explanation would be. Patrick asked if mayonnaise is an instrument, dead serious, holding that jar up like a woodwind, and the show let the joke land exactly as flat and as strange as it deserved to. No explanation, no follow-up, just a starfish, condiment, and a room full of judges trying to keep a straight face. 27 years later, that one small. Silly moment is still the detail I reach for first, when I want to explain why any of this is worth a couple of hours of your evening, more than any ratings record, more than any Tony nomination, more than any deleted scene I dug up for you tonight. It is such a small thing. It should not have lasted this long in anyone's memory, and yet here we both are, this far into the night, still somehow talking about a piece of processed condiment being mistaken, with complete sincerity, for a woodwind instrument. There is more of this particular chart I did not get to tonight, more deleted scenes sitting in wikis I have not fully read yet, more international censorship footnotes, more casting stories I have not tracked down primary sources for, the sort of material that would need its own separate evening to do properly, rather than being rushed into the last few minutes of this one. That is for another night, though, not this one. The night was always going to be partial. First pass at a chart that fans have spent the better part of 2 decades building layer by layer. I would rather leave the rest for later than pad out what is already here with anything I have not actually verified.